Hey everybody, welcome to our first virtual classroom meeting. Today we're going to continue our conversation about John Locke. And the thing that we're going to talk about in this section is this idea called social contract theory. John Locke is a social contract theorist, meaning that he is interested in finding the origins of civil society. By civil society, I mean having this idea of laws and a government. That's what we call civil society. So Locke is interested in the origins of civil society, or how civil society actually began. And social contract theory also argues that people are governed because we consent to being governed, or we agree to being governed. That's what it means to say that we consent to being governed. Now, Locke isn't the only social contract theorist. In fact, we're going to talk about another social contract theorist who's named Thomas Hobbes, but we'll talk about him in just a second. But all social contract theorists begin at a time called the state of nature. The state of nature is a time before civil society. So in other words, a time before there were governments, a time before there were laws that bound people together. Okay, social contract theorists call this time the state of nature. But underneath, where I wrote the state of nature, I put in parentheses here this term, rhetorical construct. So what do I mean by all this? Well, John Locke is not a paleontologist. John Locke is not an anthropologist. John Locke is not a historian. John Locke is a political philosopher. And what he's doing ultimately is he's arguing in favor of a very specific type of government. Okay? John Locke is arguing for a very specific type of government. So he begins at a time called the state of nature, and since he's arguing in favor of a specific type of government, that's going to influence what life was like, in his argument, before government was created. So, to clarify this, I'm going to contrast Locke's argument of what the state of nature looks like compared to this other social contract theorist named Thomas Hobbes, and what his state of nature looks like. So, you watched that video a couple of pages back about the English Civil War. And very loosely, the English Civil War was a war between two different groups of people. One group of people were called royalists, and the other group of people were called parliamentarians. And the royalists were arguing in favor of having a strong king. The parliamentarians were arguing in favor of the people having more freedom and there being limits placed on government. So going back to our very first pages in the book this week, we said that Locke argues that only limited government is legitimate. Remember? You just read that a second ago. So Locke supports this idea of the parliamentarians. In other words, the government needs to have limits placed on it. So Hobbes, who's arguing in favor of a strong king, uses this rhetorical construct of the state of nature to illustrate why we need a strong government. So Hobbes's state of nature is pure anarchy. I wrote here horrible. It's horrible. It's a horrible time with pure anarchy. Every person against every person. He famously calls his state of nature nasty, brutish, and short, meaning it's nasty, we're all always wanting to kill each other. It's brutish, meaning you just find each other and kill each other, and short, meaning it doesn't last very long. So Hobbes argues that before government, life was pure chaos in which everyone just killed everybody else. Therefore, it makes sense that when these people formed a government, remember, people in social contract theory argue that we consent to being governed, so it makes sense that Hobbes gives us a totally horrible state of nature, so when people consent to being governed, they would create a strong government, an absolute monarch who has zero, or very, very few, I should say, checks placed upon its power. Now, Locke, on the other hand, who is a parliamentarian, meaning that he argues in favor of there being limited government and the people having a lot of rights, including the right to vote, his state of nature is not too terrible. His state of nature is not that bad. So it makes sense that for Locke, this time before government existed wouldn't be too extreme. Therefore, when the people consent to being governed, they create a limited government, one that doesn't constrain all of their liberty. So remember, if you have any questions right now, you can always email me your questions at sgodfrey.peralta.edu. So, the reason that Locke's state of nature isn't too horrible is because within it there is what he calls a law of nature. In other words, there are laws that exist before governments. So it isn't only up to government to make laws, there are laws that already exist before governments. Okay? And this would go on to be incredibly influential to the founders of the United States, who argued that people have, perhaps you've heard this term, certain inalienable rights. In other words, we have rights that cannot be separated from us. That's what it means if something is inalienable. It can't be separated from us. And Locke argues that in the state of nature, which isn't too horrible, there is this set of laws called the law of nature. And this law of nature has three parts. Part number one is that everybody is born equal. Everybody is born as an equal. So just as a little sidebar here, you might be wondering if an English man in the middle of the 17th century who's arguing that everyone is born equal will be in favor of slavery. Well, in reality, historians argue about this back and forth. Some say that he was in favor of slavery, but then there's a whole group of people that say that he left behind enough literature to argue that he was actually for the abolition of slavery. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, it's one of those things that historians are still arguing about. But he argues that according to this law of nature, everyone is born as an equal. He also argues that according to this law of nature, no one has the right to harm anyone else. He also argues in this state of nature, according to his law of nature, that no one has the right to an unequal share of property. So again, according to Locke's law of nature, everyone is born as an equal. No one has the right to harm anybody else. and no one has the right to an unequal share of property. So, what does all of this have to do with politics? It has everything to do with politics. And this is where things get really interesting. What Locke is really saying here is that monarchy goes against the law of nature. That's what he's arguing here. The monarchy itself goes against the law of nature. Why? Because kings are born unequal to everybody else. Kings have the right to harm anyone they choose because they get to make whatever laws they want to make. Kings have the right to an unequal share of goods. So what he's arguing here is not only that the idea of monarchy is unnatural, but given that Locke lives in England in the middle of the 17th century, you have to assume that he believes in a Christian God, okay? So what he's ultimately arguing here is that monarchy is not only unnatural, but it's even sinful. So that's why I wrote monarchy right up there, because I'm going to do this. He's saying no to monarchy by saying that all of these things exist in the law of nature. In other words, they're part of the natural design. And if monarchy goes against these, then by extension it goes against nature, therefore goes against God, therefore is sinful. You see, it's very political, and it's all very exciting. Bye.